on the other one, you bastard!
What is the absolute worst thing you can do when you are working on a franchise? It applies to books, television, video games, movies, visual novels, any form of media you could possibly think of. It may not be something that's obvious, but it goes beyond just media itself. In fact, it's important if you're making any product for consumption. The answer may surprise you, and the ramifications for the future of the Transformers franchise will definitely disappoint.
You are now entering Diagnosis Insanity.
In 2019, IDW decided to reboot their comics lineup for two main purposes. The first was because their old universe was getting bloated and a change was sorely needed. The second, and probably the most opportunistic reason, was to bring the designs closer to the toys, most likely in a further application of the brand unification Hasbro has been trying to push for the Transformers side of things. That said, it's been over a year since it started, and sadly not much has actually happened. It went from a weekly series to a monthly series, and the story isn't exactly going anywhere fast. Personally, I don't really mind this. It echoes the stylings of Hiroya Oku's Inuyashiki or Mina Sundberg's Red Tail's Dream and Stand Still Stay Silent, where the storytelling is decompressed, allowing for the atmosphere to take center stage. That being said, the fandom isn't used to such types of storytelling, usually preferring medium or fast-paced sequences of events. Criticism of this new direction is as rampant as ever, and people are quickly calling this the worst comics run of the franchise. Can tell you right now, nothing in this run can be considered the worst. Published by Metrodome, a two-part mini-comic was included in the Generation 1 Series 2 box set release back in 2004. The two-parter was titled The Beast Within, and it quickly became one of the most hated pieces of media within the greater Transformers tapestry. It's gotten so ridiculous that tracking down a copy is prohibitively difficult, whether digital or physical. Whilst the art is done quite decently, the story remains incoherent, and the subject matter is, to put it bluntly, quite stupid. It attempts to subvert expectations of what fans have been curious about for years, and what would happen if the Dinobots actually combined. The results are actually quite similar to the actual toy we got a couple of years ago. It's horrifying. Autobots and Decepticons dying left and right, rudimentary dialogue that doesn't convey any emotion, and a climax that is far too abrupt. It's no wonder that fans despise this comic with every fiber of their being. That being said, it is meant to be a freebie with an obviously better piece of media, so no one is actually paying any money for it specifically, and honestly, as stupid as the concept is, I could see it being tackled far better under a much more seasoned writer. Don't get me wrong, it's bad, but believe me, there is no way one could consider this the absolute worst. Following that, there are a lot of candidates for what the worst Transformers comic is. Some criticize Pat Lee's weird, sketchy art style that he forced upon all of his employees, whilst others try to make us remember the abomination that is KISS players. But for me personally, that privilege goes to an oft-forgotten one-shot. Although its lack of influence on the current franchise landscape is both a blessing and a curse, for if we don't learn from the past, in this instance we are most definitely destined to repeat it. As beloved as the 1986 Transformers movie is, there are, to say the least, controversial elements within it. Whilst they are great in number, none surpass the most pivotal nostalgic moment within the consciousness of those who were children at the time. Spoilers for the 1986 movie, by the way, but in all honesty, you should probably have seen it by now. Even if you don't like G1, the film truly is a spectacle to behold. The story is well known. Hasbro didn't quite understand the cultural significance of Optimus Prime at the time, and they believed it would be in their best interests to kill the character off. Obvious plot twist, it wasn't. Not only did it permanently scar several children for life, to the point where several G1 fans to this day deliberately turn off the film when it gets to that point, but interest in the third season took a massive drop. Even with Optimus Prime's return afterwards, towards the end of the season, widespread interest in the franchise wouldn't receive the same heights for a very long time, instead plummeting lower and lower until Beast Wars had to single-handedly save it from certain doom, an honor which not many pieces of media share. Now, I'm not saying this was the defining factor of Generation 1's demise, it was just another drop in the lake alongside other aspects, such as switching up from imported Takara figures to ones Hasbro engineered from the ground up, leading to a massive dip in quality. That said, the importance of the death of Optimus Prime cannot be understated, and for those who grew up in the 80s, their disdain is, to a certain extent, understandable. Hasbro didn't treat their fanbase with respect, and that's bound to make anyone salty. And that brings us to the present matter, Transformers Deviations, what I consider to be the worst Transformers comic I have ever read, at least up until this point. Penned by Brandon Easton and illustrated by Priscilla particular Tramontano, I feel sorry for the both of them being dragged into this mess, the comic dares to ask, what would happen if Optimus Prime didn't die? What would happen if he survived and took on Unicron himself? It was part of a 2016 event where they basically stole Marvel's idea of alternate universe concepts and applied it to whatever IDW properties they had at the time. But we're not discussing those other properties because I haven't read them and I have no intention of. Often company-wide events are tricky to pull off, even if they aren't crossovers between sub-franchises. This is true of all forms of media, but especially for comics, things tend to work best when you let individual creators who are passionate about the franchise take full control over a story with as little interference as possible. In fact, many would argue that interference resulted in the death of the original IDW series. That's not to say it's impossible to deliver a truly brilliant story, but we're already one step towards falling over. To explain exactly what's wrong with the comic, I'm afraid I'll have to go into an elongated synopsis at this point. I don't want to sound like the guy who remembers it so you don't have to, because he's got his own thing and I've got mine, but trust me, this is simply laying the groundwork for Deconstruction. The comic begins somewhat abruptly, ham-fisting the reader into roughly the 19th minute mark of the 1986 movie, neither capturing the hopeless atmosphere nor the heroism of the iconic The Touch scene. But we're on a limited page count, so I can forgive it in this instance. In this version of the timeline, Cup actually managed to stop Hot Rod from attempting to help Prime, which gives Prime the opportunity to off Megatron once and for all. At which point they kind of force in one of his most famous lines, which completely goes against its meaning. At this point, the comic kind of rushes through the exposition of Starscream taking leadership and Megatron getting eaten by Unicron, as he can't bargain for his life because, well,
He's dead, Jim.
at this point, Ultra Magnus and Hot Rod start fighting for no good reason. In any other continuity, this would make sense given the character archetypes they've taken go beyond the confines of Generation 1. But here it actively goes against the established continuity and feels like it just exists for conflict's sake. Without exaggeration, they're lamenting the death of their comrades in one panel, worrying about the impending threat in the next, and then bam, suddenly they're fighting. If nothing else, this scene exists to make Hot Rod look arrogant and stupid, which again completely goes against the entire point of his character arc in the film. I'm not saying you can't deviate from the source material, but at least put some groundwork into doing so. Maybe on a limited page count, it's not the best idea to try and reinvent the wheel. Then at this point, they kind of slide some religious undertones into the story. Okay, it doesn't really go anywhere, but alright. From here, the Autobots prepare to leave, forcing Hot Rod onto Ultra Magnus in a scene that paints him as a stubborn teenager, which again would hypothetically work for any other continuity, but here it doesn't really work without the groundwork or within the context of the original 1986 movie. Either would have worked fine, but we're on a time and a page limit. At this point, Unicron somehow sneaks up on Starscream and basically holds him at tooth point until he agrees to become his slave. This scene could have worked really well if it was fleshed out, with some extra banter between the two to echo the iconic scene from the original film, but again, we're on too tight a page limit. Afterwards, they actually bring up a really interesting concept that never made it into the final version of the film. See, in the original drafts, Hot Rod was actually meant to be a Decepticon traitor, an idea previously not seen in the series. It was ultimately dropped though, because although extreme violence, occasional swearing, and numerous character deaths were perfectly acceptable, heaven forbid children get exposed to moral ambiguity. Through this concept, Hot Rod begins seeing visions of the main timeline, only to be branded a traitor by Ultra Magnus. Guess it was his turn to be treated like an idiot in the comic. God, it's like anyone who wasn't in the original 2 seasons doesn't get any respect. Ultimately, this idea goes nowhere and is ultimately cut short by the dumbest name in history. Mega Scream. King Mega Scream! Not gonna lie, the design is badass, but the name is completely stupid! Also, the vehicle mode looks hella weird. It almost looks like a cross between Starscream and Windblade. Oh god! A battle ensues, and they conveniently crash into the same planet they crashed into during the movie. At this point, they kinda just rush through this section of the original movie by having them storm the Quintesson's courtroom and beat the shit out of them. I do get the rush at this point, but I feel they try to put too much of an emphasis on the Prime is awesome aspect. It's kind of in your face. Meanwhile, the Autobots continue to belittle Hot Rod whilst Ultra Magnus gets axed off because reasons. In fact, it's not particularly clear how they escape the shuttle either. They kinda just end up outside. Unicron decides to eat Cybertron for no apparent reason, and then also for no apparent reason transforms into his robot mode. It seems this was put in here just because he transformed in the original, so he has to transform in the alternate universe as well. Hot Rod mopes around for a bit before getting picked up by Optimus Prime, and again, they kinda hammer in those religious themes with the mysterious ways of the Matrix. Prime then offers to sacrifice himself in order to defeat Unicron, but on the way he's forced to do battle with Starscream, who has combined with what seems to be Soundwave, Astro Train, Mars Toys, money laundering scheme, and Dirge. Yes, because a combining Starscream worked so well the last time, and the time before that! Before he can sacrifice himself though, Hot Rod jumps in to save the day, taking his place and dying in the explosion caused by Unicron's defeat, despite the fact he just escaped in the original. The Autobots celebrate his sacrifice, but for some reason they pay respects to Alpha Trion instead of Ultra Magnus, despite the fact Alpha Trion didn't appear in this comic. Also, they hammer in the religious aspects of the Matrix of Leadership, which is incredibly weird. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here, but on surface value this comic is pretty stupid. A what-if story works best when the characters are at the forefront of the events, and you focus on how said events shape them in ways you wouldn't really expect. What makes Into the Spider-Verse work so well is that we see this alternate reality through the eyes of Miles Morales, and we get a sense for what the other realities are like through the developments of old Peter and, to a lesser but still very well realized extent, Gwen. Deviation unfortunately isn't given the time to do any such thing, instead relying on ham-fisted exposition to rush through the film's set pieces, much like I had to ham-fist a synopsis into this video. Especially in the second half, they're really skimming over a lot of story beats just to get to the final confrontation. You don't really get a feel for the scale of the battle that was such a prominent feature in the original film, nor do you get the chance to get a feeling of how these characters differ thanks to their changed environment. Now, I'm no G1er, I don't put the original film on the highest pedestal you could possibly give any form of media, but I do understand the importance of respecting the source material. Now compare this to the recent Transformers 1984, a one-shot penned by the legendary Simon Furman and illustrated by Mad Lad Guido Guidi. If you still don't know who Guido Guidi is, shame on you. Without giving too much away, this comic reimagines the crash landing on Earth in a much darker light, outlining Optimus as a conflicted character and shocking the readers in the process. Although it works as a standalone story, and works even better if taken alongside the original Marvel comics as it actively improves the source material by adding extra context, it functions best as an alternative version of the G1 tale, making anyone eager to find out what happens next. And it was received incredibly well. At the time of writing, a few new issues have been commissioned and are well on the way to release. I, for one, am eager to see what happens in this new alternate universe, whereas with Deviations, the sooner I leave this world, the better. In general, the entire affair feels undercooked and horribly paced. Even the artwork is flat and bland, to the point where you really don't get a feel for the tone of the story. I'd go as far as to say The Beast Within had better artwork, even with its constant use of dull surprise. You really get a sense of the dire situation the Autobots are in, just from the art style, something which probably would have worked better here. Thing is, there's no reason for the artwork to look this bland. I went over Tramontano's Instagram page whilst researching the script, and her work is truly beautiful. I think I might have just found one of my favorite artists now. Just when I ditched my Instagram account because of how stupid that app is, I get pulled right back in with this gorgeous gallery of delightful pieces. Oh, wait, she has a Twitter. Thank fuck I don't have to go back to Instagram again. I've got two guesses as to why an artist as skilled as her would deliver whatever this is. The first is higher-up interference. Mayhaps she was requested to follow the line work of the original movie to a certain extent, which if that is the case is a very dumb decision, because personally I find asking an artist with such a specific art style to copy someone else's is ludicrous. I know it happens in comics all the time, but I find it pretty stupid. Let artists have their art styles. The other guess, and I feel this is more likely, is what I briefly alluded to earlier, the time constraints. I'm not sure when this so-called event was planned, and every serialized comic on the planet is under certain time constraints, but it's likely that these sorts of events are given much less time to sit in the oven than your traditional Transformers comic. This time constraint will come back later, and provide a hypothesis to what I consider the main underlying issue of this comic. On the surface, this seems like an overly edgy take on the time-honored question, but if one takes a closer look, there seems to be an underlying theme of insult, not just towards the characters themselves, although that is also prominent, but also to the target audience. This is most prevalent in the depiction of Hot Rod. Oh, you don't like Hot Rod as a leader? Well, watch him get constantly shit on to make you feel bad, only for him to sacrifice himself at the end. Yeah, you better feel sorry for him. This character archetype can be pulled off, but given the page constraints, it is quite difficult, although not impossible. However, I can't help but get the feeling that such a character arc isn't the point. There's no middle, beginning, and end. There's just things that happen to make you feel sorry for him. And even at the end, there's no payoff. It feels like this comic is targeting a certain negative group of fans. This also gets echoed in the depiction of other characters. Oh, you think Ultra Magnus should have been the leader? Well, now he's an angry buffoon with no reason and dies a horrible death off panel, and he isn't even remembered in the final page. Oh, you think Optimus Prime would have done a better job? Well, now he's almost a religious zealot, unquestioning in his worship of his MacGuffin god. Oh, you think Starscream was killed off unceremoniously? Well, let's put him in the limelight, but make him as pathetic as he's always been. Now, I'll be the first to admit, the Generation 1 sub-fandom, which I honestly don't consider myself a part of, can be quite, argumentative.
You could have gone past all of this motherfucker. You pulled the fucking trigger. I don't know, because pull the trigger.
That said, that's primarily the audience this comic is trying to capture. This isn't in the same boat as the greater IDW universe, where they are afforded the luxury of expressing a different writer's take on the subject matter. Usually I'm incredibly supportive of projects that take the original source material in new and exciting ways, even when the general consensus is that they're an insult to the original. But of all times, this is the one case where I think adhering to fan demand is the most important. That is probably an issue in itself, and can probably be used to argue why maybe this story shouldn't have been written in the first place. But whatever the case, when you read this comic, it actively feels like the author is insulting someone, even if it isn't you. If I had to compare this to another form of media to demonstrate what I mean, no better example exists than Age of Extinction. Sure, The Last Night is by far a worse film, but it was at this point that we had a shift in consciousness, where the infamous director was completely done with the franchise and just going into zombie mode. Keep in mind, after Dark of the Moon, Michael Bay was done. He wanted to make documentaries about elephant poaching, but instead he was dragged back into the firing line and gave us this piece of garbage instead. Age of Extinction actively feels like it's insulting moviegoers' intelligence, as if you're a bad person for watching it.
Need I bring up the Romeo and Juliet law scene?
That's the same feeling this comic conveys, and in both instances I have the same feelings for Brandon Easton and Michael Bay. Both are extremely talented creators, but under the restrictions of the project they are forced to work on, they are in contempt of their audiences. And that, my dear fellows, is why I consider this to be the worst Transformers comic I've come across. Contempt for your audience kills creativity. In fact, there's only one example I can think of where the person in control had contempt for their audience and still managed to deliver a solid work of fiction: Stanley Kubrick's Spartacus. It's well documented that Kubrick hated both working on the film and the end result of this illustrious project, but that story is a very long-winded one and it would drag the pacing of this video down tremendously, so all I really have to say is that such an instance is a testament to the creative prowess of Kubrick, Douglas, and everyone else involved. But such an occurrence is rare, and more often than not, Deviations is the end result of a forced project. When you actively don't like what you're working on, then by result, most likely you simply cannot deliver a satisfactory project. I have no disrespect for Easton himself, but the end result feels soulless and angry. At this point, I wish that were all there is to say, that being the worst Transformers comic, in my humble opinion, is the end of it. However, things are brewing on the horizon, and many are rightfully concerned. Transformers War for Cybertron Siege is an upcoming Netflix cartoon. Yes, cartoon, don't let the involvement of Polygon Pictures fool you. Depicting the most requested aspect of Transformers lore in the franchise history, the titular War for Cybertron. This announcement has got many heads turning, both in a good and a bad way. I myself am still skeptical about the announcement, primarily because the last time I blindly trusted a Cybertron-based series and even defended it, it came back to bite me in the ass. Personally, I don't have a problem with the animation style. We've honestly had far less expressive animations in the likes of the Unicron trilogy and Prime, but both were able to present compelling stories that stuck with the fandom long after. Well, aside from Energon, but we usually forget about that. Initially, I had my concerns about the inclusion of Rooster Teeth in the producing position, but recently I've been much more supportive. After that Genlock video I made a while ago, the series only continued to get better, building on much of what it had foreshadowed and providing some genuine twists that have made me extremely excited for Season 2. And yes, Season 2 is coming. It probably won't be on Rooster Teeth's website, but as everyone on the internet knows... Furthermore, for the first time since Volume 3, Ruby is actually good again. Somehow they managed to make a season that is truly enjoyable, even ignoring the return of several fan-favorite characters. I don't know how they managed it, considering how dog shit the previous volumes were, and I still don't think it's worth the torture of the other seasons just to get to it. But hey, they actually pulled it off. It's written very well. That's something. So with these, my confidence in the company is restored. I was also initially concerned with the inclusion of Polygon Pictures. Their works, especially recently, have been kinda shit, especially with the god-awful Netflix Godzilla trilogy. Even before that, the Blame movie provided some interesting concepts but ended up going absolutely nowhere, which killed any excitement I had for it. If I had to pick a Japanese 3D studio better suited for the job, Orange would have seemed like a much better pick after their work on Land of the Lustrous and Expelled from Paradise. I still haven't seen the furry show, so I can't quite judge it yet. But the point still stands. Still, they're just in the animation position, not in the writing and directing area, and the animation honestly looks serviceable. Yes, they've gone almost too toy accurate, but if that's what makes them sell toys, then whatever. Even the short episode count isn't worrying. After seeing several animated shows start off with a short episode count, then transition to longer and more in-depth stories, I think starting off with 6 episodes is a good choice, and at the very least, the episode length is better than the previous previous attempt, which I'll get into in a moment. But then we reach that one lingering and perhaps the most important concern of the upcoming show, the creative team. As much as we'd like to forget, Hasbro attempted to commission a similar show in years prior, and of course it failed miserably. Mishitima's Prime Wars trilogy is rightfully hated amongst the community, in many ways surpassing the levels of garbage presented by Energon and the worst of the live-action movies. Now after that series has ended, hopefully letting that god-awful company finally rot in pieces, what's happened to the creative team? Well, the showrunner is now jumping onto this new project, as well as one of the head writers. So as much as we'd all like to ignore it, the creative team between these two endeavors remains largely the same. Credit where credit is due, it's highly likely that many of the issues surrounding that series can be credited with Mishitima's terrible management. But even so, it is cause for concern. And oh look, one of the head writers is our old mate Easton. As much as I understand the surrounding circumstances these people have been in, there isn't really much to quell my skepticism. Whether War for Cybertron turns out to be good or not is still up in the air, but my gut is telling me not to get my hopes up. But hey, one of the writers was a prominent member of the Cyberverse team, and that show was brilliant, so who knows? That said, whilst I don't know the circumstances for War for Cybertron's production, we've had one writer who's likely shown scorn for the comic production schedule, and two who've gone through literal hell under the Transformers name before. Contempt for the audience is an incredible concern going forward, as much as I hate to admit it.
Part of what makes this franchise so endearing is how many of the forms of media have such a passion for the wide variety of source materials to draw from. But this comic doesn't display that, and it does put some concern on the upcoming Netflix series. If the current team on the series, new and old, isn't careful, and they don't follow history, then it could very much repeat itself. I for one am hoping that this comic remains the worst Transformers comic I have ever read, and nothing more. And I'm seriously hoping it doesn't become a prophecy for what's to come.